At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't family anymore. I was just the one paying for it. I noticed it the moment I reached the check-in table, standing beneath a white floral arch that probably cost more than my first car. The young woman smiled politely, flipping through the name cards before handing me mine with a practiced gesture. I thanked her, just like I always do, because that's how I was raised. But when I glanced down, expecting to see Margaret Wilson, grandmother of the bride, I saw something else entirely. The old lady who's paying for everything. The words were written in elegant gold script, delicate and beautiful, as if that made them any less sharp. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. Something printed wrong, maybe meant for a joke table or a rehearsal dinner prank that got mixed up. My fingers froze around the edge of the card, and I felt that strange, quiet ringing in my ears that comes when something doesn't quite make sense yet. I lifted my head, scanning the room. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above round tables dressed in ivory linens. Waiters moved gracefully between guests holding trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly near the far wall. It was a beautiful wedding. Exactly the kind of wedding I had imagined for Emily since she was a little girl playing dress-up in my living room, wrapping herself in old curtains and calling them her bridal gown. I had helped pay for this wedding, not because anyone forced me to, but because I wanted to. Because that's what you do for family. You show up. You support. You give what you can so the people you love can have something better. I had written the checks quietly over the past 6 months, venue deposit, catering, flowers, even part of the honeymoon package to Napa Valley. Each time, Daniel would say, "Mom, you don't have to," and each time I'd smile and say, "I want to." And I meant it. Or at least, I thought I did. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the girl at the table asked, noticing I hadn't moved. I smiled back at her, the way you do when you don't want to make a scene. "Yes," I said softly, pinning the card to my dress. "Everything's fine." The pin slipped through the fabric of my pale blue dress, the one my late husband, Robert, used to say made my eyes look brighter. I had taken extra time that morning, curling my silver hair just right, choosing a pair of pearl earrings he gave me on our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look like I belonged here, like I was still part of something. I stepped into the reception hall, my heels clicking gently against the polished floor. People smiled as I passed, some nodding politely, others glancing at my name tag for just a second too long before quickly looking away. It was subtle, but I noticed. You start to notice these things when you get older. The pauses, the looks, the things people don't say out loud. I spotted Daniel near the bar, laughing with a group of guests, his arm draped comfortably around Sophia's waist. She looked stunning, of course, she always did. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile. She turned slightly, her eyes brushing over me for a brief moment. Just a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to feel it. That flicker of something I couldn't quite name. I kept walking, my smile steady, my back straight. If anyone expected me to react, to pull off the tag or demand an explanation, they were going to be disappointed. I had spent too many years learning how to hold myself together in rooms where I didn't quite fit. So I found my seat, table 12, near the back, closer to the service doors than the dance floor, and I sat down quietly. I rested my hands in my lap, smoothing the fabric of my dress, feeling the small weight of that name tag against my chest. I didn't take it off. Not yet. Because something told me this wasn't a mistake. And if it wasn't a mistake, then this was just the beginning. The music continued as if nothing had happened, soft violin notes drifting through the air, while servers refilled glasses and guests laughed like they were part of something effortless and whole. And I sat there watching it all from the edge of the room, realizing how carefully everything had been arranged, not just the flowers or the seating chart, but the roles each of us were meant to play, and mine had been decided long before I walked through those doors. I could see it now in the small details, the way no one came over to greet me first, the way conversations seemed to pause for half a second when I approached, and then resume with a different tone, lighter, safer, as if I was not someone to include, but someone to acknowledge politely, and then move past. I folded my hands tighter in my lap and glanced down at the table setting in front of me, my name card placed neatly beside the plate. The same words repeated there in that same delicate script, and for a moment I wondered how many people had already read it before I even sat down. How many quiet smiles had been exchanged over it, How many times my presence had been reduced to a single line that sounded almost playful if you did not look too closely. I picked up the water glass and took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady me, because I could feel something shifting inside me. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to explain things away, when you stop telling yourself that maybe you misunderstood or that maybe people did not mean what they clearly showed you. Across the room, I saw Emily laughing with her bridesmaids, her white dress catching the light as she moved. And for a moment my chest tightened because I remembered the little girl who used to sit on my kitchen counter swinging her legs while I baked cookies, asking me if she would ever have a wedding like the one she saw in magazines. And I had told her yes, of course, because you deserve something beautiful. And I had believed that being part of that day would mean something, that I would be there not just as a guest, but as someone woven into the memory itself. But watching her now, I realized she had not looked toward me once, not even by accident, as if I had already been placed somewhere outside the frame. I turned slightly when I heard laughter behind me. Two women standing near the bar leaning in close as they spoke in voices just low enough to seem private, but not quiet enough to be unheard. I did not mean to listen, but I did. Have you seen her name tag? One of them said with a small laugh. Sophia told me about it. She said it was all in good fun. The other replied, well, I guess when you are the one covering most of the bill, you earn a title. They both chuckled softly, and I felt that same ringing in my ears again. Only this time it was sharper, clearer, because now there was no room left for doubt. This was not a mistake. This was not a mix-up at the printer or a misplaced card. This was intentional, crafted, shared, and accepted. I set my glass down carefully, making sure my hands did not tremble, and I straightened my shoulders just a little more, because I understood something in that moment that I had been avoiding for longer than I cared to admit. This had not started today. This was simply the first time it had been displayed so openly, so confidently, like they no longer felt the need to hide it. And as I sat there in that beautiful room filled with music and light, I realized that the loneliness I felt was not new. It had just finally found its name. Daniel finally noticed me when the first round of speeches began. He made his way over with that familiar smile, the one that used to mean something when he was a boy asking for help with homework or advice about his first job. But now it felt practiced, like something he wore for other people. Mom, there you are, he said, leaning down just enough to kiss my cheek, his attention already drifting back toward the room behind him. Everything okay? I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, searching for something that used to be so easy to find. And then I gave him the same answer I had given everyone else. Yes, everything is fine. He nodded quickly, relieved, as if that was all he needed to hear, as if my comfort was just another box to check before moving on. And then Sophia appeared at his side, her hand sliding effortlessly onto his arm, her smile warm and polished. Margaret, I am so glad you made it, she said, her voice light, almost musical, the kind of tone that could make anyone else believe she meant every word. I returned her smile, matching her calm. Of course, I would not miss this. Her eyes flickered briefly to my name tag, and for just a second, there was something there. Not surprise, not concern, but satisfaction, quickly hidden behind that perfect expression. Is everything to your liking? She asked, gesturing subtly toward the room, the decorations, the tables, the entire carefully curated event. I let my gaze follow her gesture, taking in the chandeliers, the floral arrangements, the guests dressed in soft pastels and tailored suits, and I nodded slowly. It is beautiful. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if waiting for something more, perhaps a question, perhaps a complaint, but I gave her nothing else, and after a brief pause, she smiled again, tighter this time. Good. We wanted everything to be perfect. And then she turned, guiding Daniel back into the center of the room, leaving me exactly where I had been, on the edge. I watched them walk away together, how naturally they fit into the space, how easily they belonged, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever had been building over the years, they were no longer even trying to hide it. It was not just about money or convenience. It was about position, about control, about deciding who mattered and who did not. The speeches began. Emily's new husband spoke first, his voice steady and grateful, thanking everyone who had made the day possible, listing names, parents, friends, Even distant relatives who had contributed in small ways. I listened carefully, not because I expected anything, but because part of me still wanted to believe there would be some acknowledgement, some small recognition of the role I had played, but my name never came. Not once. The applause filled the room, warm and generous, and I joined in politely, my hands moving in rhythm with everyone else, even as that quiet clarity inside me deepened. This was not an oversight. This was consistency, the same pattern repeated in different forms. Smaller moments I had ignored before suddenly lined up in my mind. The missed calls, the last-minute invitations that felt more like obligations than genuine requests, the subtle shifts in tone when decisions were made without me. And I understood now that I had been slowly moved out of the center of this family, not abruptly, not dramatically, but carefully, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to question. I glanced down at the name tag again, the gold lettering catching the light, and for the first time, I did not feel confused or even hurt. I felt certain that this was exactly how they saw me, not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a resource, something useful as long as it was needed, and easy to dismiss once it was not. I reached up and pressed the edge of the tag gently against the fabric of my dress, securing it in place. Because I was not going to take it off, not yet. If this was the role they had given me, then I would wear it just a little longer, long enough to understand exactly how far this went, and more importantly, long enough to decide what I was going to do next. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same careful balance of elegance and exclusion, as if every moment had been designed to look flawless while quietly reinforcing where I stood, or rather, where I no longer stood. Dinner was served in courses, each plate more intricate than the last. Conversations rose and fell around me like gentle waves, and I found myself nodding at the right moments, offering polite smiles, answering questions with just enough warmth to appear engaged without inviting anything deeper, because by then I understood that this was not a space meant for me to participate in, only to occupy. Across the table, a couple I did not know asked how I was related to the bride, their tone friendly, curious, and I answered simply, "I am her grandmother." They smiled, impressed, one of them glancing briefly at my name tag before quickly looking back up. "That is wonderful," she said, though there was a flicker of something in her expression, the kind of hesitation people have when they realize they have just stepped into something they do not fully understand. I spared her the discomfort by changing the subject, asking about where they had traveled from, letting the conversation drift into safer territory, because I had no interest in explaining myself. Not tonight. Not here. As the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed slightly for the first dance, I watched Emily step onto the floor with her husband, her hand resting lightly in his, her smile bright and unguarded. And for a moment, I let myself feel proud, because regardless of everything else, she looked happy, and that mattered, or at least it used to. But even that feeling was different now, quieter, edged with something I could not ignore, because happiness built on something fragile has a way of revealing itself over time, and I had lived long enough to recognize that. I shifted in my chair and noticed a man standing near the edge of the room, older, perhaps in his late 60s, watching the dance with a thoughtful expression. He caught my eye and gave a small nod, not intrusive, not overly familiar, just an acknowledgement, and after a moment he made his way over. "Margaret, is it?" he said, his voice calm, steady. I nodded, surprised that he knew my name without looking at the card. "Yes," he smiled faintly. "I worked with your husband years ago, Robert Wilson. He spoke about you often." The mention of Robert settled something in me, like a memory finding its place again. "That is kind of you to say," I replied, and for the first time that evening, the conversation felt real, grounded in something that had not been shaped by pretense. He glanced around the room briefly before lowering his voice just enough to remain discreet. "I was not sure if I should say anything, but I thought you might want to know." I held his gaze, not reacting, simply listening. "I overheard part of a conversation earlier, near the planning table. Your daughter-in-law was speaking with one of the event coordinators." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She referred to you as the financial backer, said it was easier to keep things streamlined if decisions stayed between immediate family." The words settled between us, quiet, precise, and I felt that clarity sharpen even further, not because this was new information, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. I see, I said, my voice even. He studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting surprise or anger, but I offered neither. I thought you should know, he added, and I nodded once. I appreciate that. He gave a small, respectful smile before stepping away, leaving me once again at the table, surrounded by music and laughter that no longer felt distant, but defined, as if every sound now carried meaning I could not ignore. I reached for my glass again, taking another slow sip, and as I set it down, I realized something important, something I had not fully allowed myself to accept until that moment. This was not just about being overlooked or taken for granted. This was about being intentionally managed, positioned, and limited, and the realization did not break me. It steadied me. Because once you see something clearly, you no longer have to question it. And once you no longer question it, you can begin to decide what comes next. The music shifted into something livelier as the evening moved forward, guests drifting toward the dance floor while others gathered in small circles, glasses in hand, voices rising just enough to blend into a pleasant hum. And I remained seated for a while longer, watching, listening, letting the rhythm of the room settle into something I could read more clearly now. Because once you stop assuming warmth, you begin to notice patterns. I saw how Sophia moved through the crowd, greeting certain guests with enthusiasm, guiding conversations, subtly directing attention, and I realized she was not just participating in the evening. She was controlling it. Every introduction, every acknowledgement, every omission felt deliberate, and Daniel followed her lead without hesitation, his role quieter but no less aligned. As if this dynamic had been established long before tonight, I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, and made my way toward the edge of the dance floor, not to join, but to observe. From a different angle, a few guests nodded as I passed, polite, distant, and I returned the gesture with the same measured calm. Near the bar I paused, reaching for a glass of sparkling water, and that was when I heard my name again, spoken just behind me. Margaret has always been generous, a woman said, her tone light, but carrying something underneath. Sophia mentioned she handled most of the major expenses. Another voice responded, well, it makes things easier when you have someone willing to step in like that. There was a brief pause, followed by a softer laugh, especially when they do not mind staying in the background. I did not turn around. I did not interrupt. I simply stood there for a moment longer, letting the words settle without resistance, because they no longer surprised me. They confirmed what had already been laid out piece by piece throughout the evening. I took a sip of my drink and stepped away, moving toward a quieter corner near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. The night air pressed gently against the glass, cool and steady, and for the first time since I arrived, I allowed myself to think back, not to tonight, but to the years leading up to it. The first time Daniel and Sophia asked for help with their down payment, how grateful they had been, how often they called then, how involved I felt in their lives, then the renovations, the vacations, the small business investment that never quite returned what it promised, each request framed carefully, never demanded, always presented as something temporary, something reasonable, and each time I said yes without hesitation, because that is what family does, or at least what I believe family did. But looking back now, I saw the pattern more clearly, how the gratitude had faded faster each time, how the calls became less frequent once the need was met, how decisions began to happen without me even when they directly involved things I had contributed to. It was not sudden, it was gradual, almost unnoticeable until you stepped back far enough to see the full picture. And tonight, everything had come into focus, not because of a single moment, but because all the moments had finally aligned. I rested my hand lightly against the cool surface of the window, watching the reflection of the room behind me, the movement, the laughter, the carefully arranged happiness, and I realized something that felt both simple and undeniable. I had mistaken access for belonging. I had believed that being needed meant being valued, and I had been wrong. The difference was subtle, but it mattered, because one could be withdrawn the moment it was no longer convenient. I straightened slightly, letting my hand fall back to my side, and turned away from the glass, the weight of the name tag still resting against my chest, not as something to hide, but as something to understand, because now that I could see it clearly, I was no longer standing in confusion. I was standing at the edge of a decision, and for the first time that evening, I felt something shift that was not quiet and not uncertain, but steady, deliberate, and entirely my own. The evening carried on as if it had reached its peak, laughter growing louder, music filling the space between conversations, and yet for me, everything had slowed into something quieter, more deliberate. I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was observing it, measuring it, understanding it in a way I had not allowed myself to before. I walked back toward my table, my steps steady, my posture unchanged, because nothing about me needed to shift outwardly. Not yet. As I reached my seat, I noticed my purse resting exactly where I had left it, small, structured, familiar, and I placed my hand on it for a moment, grounding myself in something that was still entirely mine. The room behind me continued its celebration, but I was no longer part of that rhythm. I was separate from it now, and that separation felt clearer with every passing minute. Daniel approached again, this time alone, his tie loosened slightly, his expression softer, perhaps from the evening, perhaps from the atmosphere. "Mom, have you eaten enough?" he asked, his tone casual, routine. I looked up at him and nodded. Yes. Everything was lovely, he smiled, relieved again. Always relieved when there was nothing to fix, nothing to question. Good. I just wanted to make sure. He lingered for a second, as if considering whether to say something more, but then he did what he had done all evening. He chose ease over depth. "We are going to cut the cake soon," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the center of the room. I nodded once more. "I will be here." He gave a small nod in return and stepped away, and as I watched him go, I realized how practiced this distance had become, how natural it was for him now to keep things light, surface level, uncomplicated, because anything deeper might require him to see what he had been avoiding. I reached into my purse slowly, not searching for anything in particular, just allowing the motion to center me. My fingers brushed against a folded envelope I had placed there earlier that day, something I had not planned to use, something that had been there out of habit, more than intention, and I paused for a moment, my hand resting over it, not pulling it out, not yet, just acknowledging its presence, because suddenly it felt less like an afterthought and more like a possibility. I closed my purse gently and placed it back on the table, my gaze lifting toward the room again. Sophia stood near the cake table now, directing the staff with quiet confidence, adjusting details, ensuring everything unfolded exactly as she wanted, and I saw it clearly now. The way she positioned herself at the center of every moment, how she shaped the narrative of the evening without ever raising her voice, how everyone around her responded without question. It was not loud control. It was subtle, practiced, effective, and for a long time, I had mistaken that for capability, for organization, for care, but tonight I understood it for what it was, influence built on quiet exclusions. I watched as Emily joined her, smiling, trusting, unaware, and for a brief moment, I felt something close to sadness again, not for myself this time, but for how easily things can be shaped when no one questions the person holding the frame. The cake was brought out, candles glowing softly, guests gathering closer, phones lifting to capture the moment, and I stood with them, just another figure in the crowd, my hands resting calmly at my sides, the name tag still in place, because I had not removed it, not because I accepted it, but because it had shown me something I needed to see. As the room filled with applause and voices joined in celebration, I felt none of the confusion that had been there when I first arrived, none of the quiet attempts to explain things away. What I felt now was something steadier, something that did not need to be spoken out loud, because it was already decided. I had spent years giving without question, believing that my place in this family was understood, that it was secure, but standing there in that moment, surrounded by people who had already rewritten that place without telling me, I realized that understanding only works when it goes both ways, and if it does not, then it is not understanding at all, it is assumption, and assumptions can be corrected. I reached up slowly and adjusted the edge of the name tag, not removing it, just straightening it, as if it belonged exactly where it was for now, because I was not finished with this evening, and I was not finished learning what needed to be learned. But one thing had already changed, quietly, completely, and without announcement. I was no longer standing here as someone waiting to be included. I was standing here as someone preparing to step away on my own terms. The applause lingered as the cake was cut, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in celebration, and I stood there just long enough to be seen participating, just long enough to blend into the moment without drawing attention, because I understood now that visibility did not mean presence, and presence did not mean belonging. When the first slices were passed around, I accepted one politely, holding the plate without really tasting anything, my attention shifting instead to the subtle movements happening around me. Sophia speaking quietly with one of the event coordinators again, her hand gesturing toward a clipboard, her tone calm but firm. Daniel standing nearby, nodding along without question, and I realized that even now, even in the closing moments of the evening, she was still directing, still shaping, still ensuring that everything unfolded exactly as she intended. I set the untouched cake down on the nearest table and stepped away, moving toward the hallway that led to the restrooms, not because I needed to go, but because I needed a moment away from the carefully constructed atmosphere. The hallway was quieter, the music softened by distance, the lighting dimmer, and I paused there for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around me. It was the first time all evening that I felt fully outside of the performance, fully removed from the expectations of smiling, nodding, participating. I reached up slowly and unpinned the name tag, holding it between my fingers. As I looked down at the words again, the gold script still elegant, still deliberate, but no longer confusing, no longer sharp, because now it was simply information, a statement of how I had been seen, and once something is clear, it loses its power to wound. I turned the card over, running my thumb along the blank back, and for a moment, I considered leaving it there on the hallway table, letting it become just another discarded detail of the evening. But instead, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse, because I was not ready to let it go, not yet. As I stood there, I heard voices approaching from the other end of the hallway, familiar ones, Sophia and another woman, their footsteps slowing as they neared, their conversation lowering but not enough to disappear. "We should start discussing the house soon," the other woman said quietly. "After tonight, it is probably the right time," Sophia responded, her tone measured. "Daniel agrees. It is too much space for her, and it makes more sense for us long term." There was a pause, followed by a softer voice. "Do you think she will resist?" Sophia let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "She will not. She never does. She just needs a little time to adjust, and we will frame it as helping her." The words settled into the quiet hallway with a clarity that did not need interpretation, and I remained where I was, unseen, listening not because I needed more confirmation, but because it was there, offered without awareness of my presence, unfiltered, honest in a way that politeness never is. The footsteps moved past, their voices fading as they returned to the reception, and I stayed there for a few seconds longer, not reacting, not rushing, simply absorbing what had been said, because this was no longer about a name tag, or a moment of humiliation dressed as humor. This was about intention, about plans already forming, about decisions being made on my behalf without my knowledge. I closed my purse gently and lifted my head, my reflection faintly visible in the mirror at the end of the hallway. And for the first time that evening, I looked at myself not as someone trying to understand what was happening, but as someone who had already understood. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty, only clarity, and clarity does something very specific. It removes hesitation. I smoothed my dress once more, adjusted my posture, and stepped back toward the reception, not as someone returning to the same place, but as someone who now saw that place for exactly what it was, because whatever they believed about me, whatever role they had quietly assigned, they had made one mistake. They had assumed that understanding would make me smaller, easier, more compliant, but understanding does not always work that way. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it changes everything without a single word being spoken. When I stepped back into the reception hall, nothing had changed on the surface. The music was still playing, the laughter still floated through the air, and the lights still cast that soft golden glow over everything. But for me, the entire room felt different, not because it had shifted, but because I moved through the space slowly, deliberately, no longer trying to find my place within it, but simply observing it for what it was, a carefully arranged picture where every role had already been assigned, and mine had been quietly reduced to something convenient, something temporary, something they believed they could manage without consequence. I returned to my table, but I did not sit right away. Instead, I rested, my hand lightly on the back of the chair, looking out across the room one more time. Daniel was speaking with a group of guests, relaxed, smiling, unaware, or perhaps choosing not to be aware. Sophia stood near the center again, effortlessly guiding conversations, adjusting details, her presence steady and controlled, and Emily remained surrounded by friends, glowing in a way that made everything else seem secondary. And I realized that this evening had never really been about celebration for me. It had been about revelation. I sat down slowly, my movements calm, measured, and I reached into my purse once more, this time not hesitating, my fingers finding the folded envelope I had touched earlier. I pulled it out just enough to feel its edges, not opening it, not revealing it, just acknowledging its weight, because now it meant something different than it had that morning. It was no longer just a document. It was a choice. I slid it back into place and closed my purse gently, my eyes lifting again as the music shifted and guests began gathering for another round of dancing. The evening was moving toward its final moments, and I understood that whatever I chose to do next did not need to happen here, not tonight, because timing is not about urgency. It is about precision, and I had no intention of acting in a moment that would be dismissed as emotion. I stood again, smoothing my dress. And this time when I moved through the room, I did not look for familiar faces. I did not wait for acknowledgement. I simply walked, steady and composed, toward the exit. A few guests glanced my way, offering polite smiles, and I returned them without pause, without hesitation, because nothing about this departure needed to be explained. As I reached the doors, I paused for just a second, not to reconsider, but to take in the room one final time. The music, the voices, the carefully constructed happiness that no longer held any illusion for me. And then I stepped outside, the night air cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. I took a slow breath, feeling the stillness settle around me. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible exhale of something that had been building all night. Not sadness, not anger, but release, because clarity has a way of simplifying things, of removing the need to question or justify. I walked toward the parking area, my heels steady against the pavement, my posture unchanged, and as I reached my car, I paused once more, opening my purse and taking out the folded name tag. I looked at it again under the dim light, the gold lettering no longer sharp, no longer heavy, just a reminder, a piece of evidence from a moment that had revealed far more than it intended to. I folded it again carefully and placed it back inside. Then I took out the envelope, holding it for a moment longer this time, not opening it yet, but knowing exactly what it contained, and more importantly, what it represented. I closed my purse, unlocked my car, and sat behind the wheel, the quiet surrounding me completely now. And as I started the engine, I realized something that felt both simple and absolute. They believed they had already decided my place, already shaped my role, already planned what would come next. But what they did not understand was that I had just made a decision of my own, one that did not require confrontation, did not require explanation, and certainly did not require permission, because some changes do not begin with a conversation, they begin in silence, and by the time they are seen, it is already too late to stop them. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but full, like every thought is already settled into place and no longer needs to be chased. The road stretched ahead under the soft glow of streetlights, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my posture the same as it had been all evening, composed, controlled, but inside something had shifted in a way that would not reverse. I did not turn on the radio. I did not reach for my phone. I simply drove, letting the silence remain intact, because for the first time in a long while, I was not trying to fill it. When I reached my house, I sat in the driveway for a moment before stepping out, looking at the front of it the way one does when something familiar begins to feel different, not unfamiliar, but newly understood. The porch light was still on, casting a warm glow across the steps, and I walked inside, closing the door gently behind me. The house greeted me with the same stillness it always had, but tonight it felt less like loneliness and more like space, space that had not been taken, not been shaped by anyone else, space that was entirely mine. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and removed my shoes, setting them neatly by the door, the small routines grounding me in something steady and certain. I moved through the house slowly, turning on a single lamp in the living room, its soft light filling the space without overwhelming it, and I sat down in the chair Robert used to favor, the one by the window, where he would read in the evenings. I rested my hands in my lap for a moment, then reached into my purse and took out the folded name tag, placing it on the table in front of me. I looked at it again, not with confusion, not with hurt, but with clarity, because now it was no longer about what it said, it was about what it revealed. I let out a slow breath and then reached for the envelope, unfolding it. Carefully this time, inside were the documents I had reviewed weeks ago with my attorney, papers that outlined the structure of my assets, the ownership of this house, the accounts that had been built over decades, and more importantly, the control over how and when any of it would be transferred. I read through the first page again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of it, every line clear, every condition deliberate, nothing vague, nothing assumed. I set the papers down beside the name tag, the two items resting next to each other, one representing how I had been seen, the other representing what was actually true, and the contrast between them was almost quiet in its simplicity. I leaned back slightly, my gaze moving between them, and I realized that everything they had planned, every conversation whispered in hallways, every assumption made without me, had been built on something incomplete. They believed they understood my position, my role, my limits, but they had never asked, never confirmed, never considered that there might be more beneath the surface than what was convenient for them to see. I reached forward and folded the documents again, placing them back into the envelope with care, not rushing, not hesitating, because there was no urgency in what came next, only intention. I picked up the name tag one last time and held it for a moment before placing it on top of the envelope, aligning the edges neatly, as if they belonged together for now. A reminder paired with a decision. I stood slowly, carrying both items with me as I moved toward the small desk in the corner of the room, the one I had not used in some time. I opened the drawer and placed the envelope inside, the name tag resting on top of it. Then I closed it gently, my hand lingering there for just a second, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement, because what I had decided did not need to be spoken out loud. It did not need to be announced or explained. It would unfold in its own time, in its own way, and when it did, it would not be a reaction. It would be a result. I turned off the lamp and stood there in the quiet for a moment longer, the house settling around me, steady and unchanged. And as I made my way toward the hallway, I understood something with a calm certainty that did not waver. They thought they had already defined my place in their lives, but they had only defined how they saw me, not who I was. And the difference between those two things was something they had not yet begun to understand, but they would.